Soap stung like hornet venom against raw skin. A heavy oak bucket rattled against the flagstones, spilling dirty water over already freezing fingers. Lye and stale lavender choked the air in the grand hallway of Oakhaven. Down on bruised knees, a girl with a bruised spirit scrubbed at a stain that wasn't there. High society thrives on invisible stains. They force the lowly to scrub them out, just to prove they hold the leash. Until someone cuts it. The floorboards in the East Gallery were cut from ancient oak, grooved by 2 centuries of aristocratic footfalls. Margot knew every imperfection in them. She knew the splintered knot near the portrait of the 3rd Earl, which always caught the edge of her rag. She knew the slight dip by the window where rainwater had once warped the wood. Right now, her world consisted entirely of these wooden grooves, the stinging reek of lye soap, and the agonizing ache at the base of her spine. Scrape, scrub, wring. Her knuckles were split. The harsh chemical bite of the soap had long since eaten through the top layer of her skin, leaving the flesh raw and weeping a thin, watery pink into the scrub bucket. Margot didn't cry. Crying required energy, and she had traded the last of her energy for a stale piece of bread at dawn. She was a pragmatist. Tears wouldn't wash the floor faster, and they certainly wouldn't soften the heart of the woman standing 10 feet away. Countess Henrietta paced. Her velvet slippers made a soft, whispering sound against the dry sections of the floor. Shh, shh, shh. It was a terrifying sound. It meant she was watching. You missed a spot, Margot. Henrietta's voice was perfectly modulated, carrying the melodic, effortless cruelty of a woman who had never washed her own hair, let alone a floor. Just there, by the skirting board. Margot paused. Her shoulders burned with a dull, throbbing heat. She didn't look up. Looking up was a mistake. Looking up meant Henrietta would see the exhaustion in her eyes, and Henrietta fed on exhaustion like a starved hound. Yes, my lady, Margot said. Her voice was flat, hoarse. She dragged her sodden skirts an inch to the left, feeling the cold dampness seep through the thin wool and bite into her bare knees. She dipped the stiff bristled brush back into the bucket. The water was lukewarm and gray. She brought it down on the wood. Scrape, scrub. There was no spot. The floor was stripped bare, scrubbed so violently it looked bleached. But this wasn't about dirt. It was about yesterday afternoon in the drawing room. Margot had been serving tea. The Duke of Westmoreland had arrived early from London. He had reached for a sugar tong, his fingers had brushed Margot's wrist, and he had looked at her. Not through her, as lords looked at servants, but at her. He had seen the dark circles under her eyes, the burn scar on her thumb, the frayed cuff of her uniform. And he had said, "Thank you." Henrietta had seen the exchange. The Countess had spent 3 weeks and a small fortune on silk gowns to ensure the Duke looked at no one but her. A maid receiving a second of the Duke's genuine attention was a transgression that demanded punishment. "Put your back into it," Henrietta murmured, stopping near Margot's bucket. The heavy scent of expensive rosewater rolled off the Countess, clashing sickeningly with the harsh lie. "You girls from the lower city are all the same. Lazy. Waiting for a handout. You think a pretty face excuses you from honest labor?" Margot clamped her jaw shut. A sharp retort flared in her mind. "I work 16 hours a day, you painted ghoul," but she swallowed it down like bitter medicine. She needed the 6 shillings a week. Her father's lungs were filling with fluid back in their drafty tenement in the city, and the apothecary wouldn't hand over willow bark for free. Pride was a luxury for the rich. Margot couldn't afford it. She leaned forward, pressing her weight onto the brush. The stiff palmyra bristles groaned against the oak. Her left knee slipped in a puddle of soapy water, and she caught herself with a sharp gasp, jarring her wrist. Pain shot up her forearm. "Clumsy," Henrietta sighed, examining her own immaculate manicured nails. "If you cannot finish the gallery by noon, Margot, I will have Mrs. Higgins deduct a day's wages. We cannot have filth in Oakhaven, not when the Duke is taking his luncheon with us." Margot's stomach turned over, a hollow, acidic churn. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the stinging in her knuckles, and scrubbed harder. The rhythm of the brush became a desperate, angry metronome. She hated the wood. She hated the soap. She hated the system that put a woman like Henrietta in velvet and a girl like her in wet wool. But most of all, she hated herself for hoping, just for a second, that the Duke's polite nod yesterday had meant the world was anything but a cold, rigid machine. The great oak doors at the end of the East Gallery did not open with a gentle click. They swung inward with a heavy, groaning thud, letting in a sudden gust of wet, autumn air. The wind swept down the long corridor, instantly chilling the sweat on the back of Margot's neck. She shivered, shrinking into herself, but she didn't stop moving the brush. To stop was to draw attention. Footsteps echoed against the marble foyer just beyond the gallery. They were heavy, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. The sharp clack of a riding crop slapping against a leather boot cut through the quiet. Henrietta spun around, her velvet skirts flaring. The sneer on her face vanished so quickly it was as if she had peeled off a mask. In its place bloomed a radiant, breathless smile. She reached up, patting her perfectly coiled hair, her posture straightening into a picture of aristocratic grace. "Your Grace?" Henrietta breathed, her voice suddenly entirely devoid of its earlier sharp edges. "I did not expect you down from your chambers so early. I thought you would be resting after your ride." Margot kept her head down, staring at the swirling gray water in her bucket. "Keep scrubbing," she told herself. "Become the floor. Become invisible." Alistair, the Duke of Westmoreland, stepped from the marble onto the wooden floorboards of the gallery. He smelled of rain, damp horsehair, and fine leather, a stark, earthy scent that immediately overpowered Henrietta's cloying rosewater. "I found no comfort in resting, Lady Henrietta," Alistair's voice rumbled. It was a deep baritone, devoid of the affected drawl most aristocrats carried. It sounded tired. It sounded like a man who had seen too much and cared for too little. "The house is quiet. I thought I might take a turn about the grounds before luncheon." "Oh, but the weather's wretched." Henrietta took a few quick steps toward him, closing the distance. Margot could see the hem of Henrietta's gown swishing past her bucket. "You must allow me to entertain you in the morning room. We have a fire roaring, and I ordered a fresh pot of Ceylon." Alistair stopped. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, tight and uncomfortable. Margot's brush scraped against the wood. Swish, swish, swish. In the quiet of the gallery, the sound was suddenly deafening. Margot squeezed her eyes shut. "Don't look at me. Look at her. Please, just look at her." "What is happening here?" Alistair asked. The tone of his voice had shifted. The polite, distant hum was gone, replaced by a sharp, cold edge. Henrietta laughed, a high, nervous sound that fluttered like a trapped bird. "Oh, pay no mind to the girl, Your Grace. A clumsy maid. She spilled a tray of ashes earlier and is simply rectifying her mistake. You know how difficult it is to find decent help these days. One must be firm." Margot's grip on the brush tightened until her knuckles went entirely white beneath the raw red burns. Ashes. She hadn't been near a fireplace all morning. The lie was so smooth, so casually delivered, it made Margot feel physically sick. "Ashes," Alistair repeated. The word hung in the air, heavy and loaded. "Yes. Now, if you'll just follow me." Alistair didn't move. Margot could see the tips of his boots. They were black leather, splattered with fresh mud from the morning's rain. They were pointed toward her. "I was unaware," Alistair said, his voice dropping an octave, "that cold ashes required lye soap to remove." Henrietta faltered. Well, the stain—" The boots moved. They bypassed the Countess entirely. Henrietta let out a small, confused sound, a half-formed word caught in her throat. Margot's breathing turned shallow. The heavy, measured thud of the Duke's boots approached her. She desperately wanted to scramble backward, to grab her bucket and flee, but training and fear kept her anchored to the floor. She kept her chin tucked to her chest, scrubbing frantically at a dry piece of wood, her hands shaking so violently the brush rattled. The boots stopped mere inches from her wet, muddy knees. Margot stared at the mud on the leather. She smelled the rain on his coat. A drop of water fell from his heavy woolen cloak, landing with a tiny splash in her gray, soapy bucket. "Stop," a voice said. It was right above her. Margot didn't stop. If she stopped, she was acknowledging him. A maid does not acknowledge a duke unless ordered by her mistress. She scrubbed harder, a frantic, desperate motion. The lie bit into a fresh split on her thumb, and she sucked in a sharp, hissing breath through her teeth. "I said stop." It wasn't a shout. It was a quiet, absolute command. Margot's arms froze. She left her hands resting on the wooden block of the brush, her head still bowed. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths. Panic, cold and sharp as cracked ice, bloomed in her stomach. What had she done? Had she splashed his boots? Was he going to strike her? Aristocrats had struck her for less. Behind them, Henrietta let out a breathless, agitated sigh. "Your Grace, please, she is filthy. Do not soil your clothes. I will have the housekeeper discipline her for being underfoot." "Quiet, Henrietta." The Countess cut off with a sharp gasp, as if she had been slapped. Margot squeezed her eyes shut. "I am going to be fired. I am going to be fired, and father will die." The cynicism that usually armored her heart cracked. True, ugly fear leaked in. Then there was a sound Margot could not immediately process. It was the heavy rustle of thick wool and the creak of knee-high leather boots bending. A shadow fell over her. Margot opened her eyes and gasped, throwing herself backward. She scrambled awkwardly on her wet hands and knees, her wet skirts twisting around her legs, tangling her. She bumped into the heavy oak bucket, sloshing gray water over the brim. Alistair, the Duke of Westmoreland, had dropped to one knee. He didn't kneel gracefully. He knelt like a soldier taking cover. The fine wool of his gray trousers sank directly into the soapy puddle of dirty water Margot had just spilled. The dark fabric instantly soaked it up, turning black. He didn't seem to notice. Margot was frozen, kneeling a foot away, her eyes wide and locked on him. She couldn't help it. She was breaking the rules, staring him dead in the face. He was not conventionally handsome. He had a harsh, angular face, weathered by wind and perhaps by grief. His eyes were the dull color of oxidized silver, heavy-lidded and intensely focused. There was a small white scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Right now, those silver eyes were fixed entirely on her hands. Margot instinctively tried to pull her hands back, to hide them in the folds of her apron. They were a horror to look at, swollen, bright red, the skin peeling at the knuckles, crusted with small amounts of dried blood and fresh, pink weeping sores from the chemical burn of the lie. Before she could hide them, he moved. His hand darted out. He didn't grab her wrist aggressively, but his grip was firm, warm, and utterly immovable. He wore no gloves. His skin was calloused. The hands of a man who rode hard and perhaps fought, not the soft, powdered hands of the lords she was used to serving. "Your Grace!" Henrietta shrieked from across the hall, abandoning all pretense of poise. The slap of her slippers grew frantic as she ran toward them. "What are you doing? She is diseased. Let her go." Alistair ignored her. He held Margot's trembling hand suspended in the air between them. He stared at the burns. A muscle in his jaw twitched, tight and violent. Margot's heart hammered a sickening rhythm against her ribs. She tried to pull her hand back, but his fingers held her steady. The heat of his palm against her freezing, wet skin was a shocking contrast. "This is lie," Alistair said. He didn't look at Henrietta. He looked directly into Margot's eyes. Undiluted. Margot's throat worked, but no sound came out. She gave a jerky, terrified nod. Alistair finally let go of her hand, but he didn't stand up. Instead, he reached into the dirty, freezing puddle on the floor. His large hand closed around the wooden handle of the stiff, bristled brush Margot had dropped. Henrietta skidded to a halt 2 feet away, her hands flying to her cheeks in unadulterated horror. "Alistair! Stop this madness at once! You are ruining your trousers. You are making a mockery of this house." Alistair looked at the brush. He looked at the harsh, unyielding bristles. Then, slowly, he turned his head to look up at Henrietta. The look on his face wasn't rage. It was disgust. Pure, freezing, bottomless disgust. "You made her scrub a dry floor with raw lye," Alistair said, his voice dropping into a deadly, quiet register. "Because I thanked her for a cup of tea." Henrietta's face went chalk white. The rouge on her cheeks suddenly looked clownish and stark. I do not know what you mean. She spilled ashes." "There are no ashes, Henrietta. There is only your terrifying, pathetic vanity." Alistair turned back to the floor. Margot watched, paralyzed, as the Duke of Westmoreland dipped the brush into the bucket. The soapy water splashed over his mud-caked boots. He brought the brush down onto the wooden floorboards. He leaned his weight into it. Scrape. Scrub. The sound echoed through the deathly silent hall. Henrietta stood frozen, her mouth open in a silent, horrified scream. Margot knelt in the puddle, her raw hands hovering over her lap, staring at the broad shoulders of a duke as he scrubbed the floor in her place. "Go to the kitchens," Alistair said, his voice gruff, his eyes fixed on the grain of the wood as he moved the brush back and forth. "Have the cook smear honey and bandage your hands. Put it on my account." Margot couldn't move. Her brain refused to process the sensory input, the smell of his damp cloak, the sound of the brush, the sight of a lord doing servant's work. "That is a command, girl," Alistair added softly, not looking up. "Go." Margot swallowed hard, the cynicism in her chest cracking wide open to let in a terrifying, dangerous spark of awe. She scrambled backward, her wet skirts clinging to her legs, and stood up. She didn't look at Henrietta as she turned and ran down the hall, the sound of the Duke scrubbing the oak floor following her all the way into the dark. The servants' staircase was a steep, narrow throat of unpolished stone that swallowed the light the further down you went. Margot took the steps 2 at a time, her wet boots slipping dangerously on the worn grooves. She didn't hold the handrail. She couldn't. She kept her hands suspended in front of her chest, fingers splayed like grotesque, rigid claws. The kitchens of Oakhaven hit her before she reached the bottom. The wall of heat was physical, thick with the heavy, greasy scent of roasting mutton, burnt sugar, and boiling cabbage. It was a chaotic, deafening subterranean world. Scullery maids shouted over the hiss of massive iron skillets. Pots clanged. The heavy thump of a meat cleaver hitting a wooden block kept a violent, steady rhythm in the corner. Margot stumbled into the cavernous room, blinking against the sudden sting of wood smoke. "Out of the way, you daft cow!" a footman barked, shoving past her with a silver platter piled high with peeled potatoes. Margot staggered, her shoulder hitting the brick wall. Her left hand brushed against the rough masonry. A fresh, blinding spike of pain shot up her arm, so intense it tasted like copper in the back of her throat. She clamped her lips together to trap the whimper, her knees buckling slightly. Mrs. Gable, the head cook, stood by the massive hearth, a sweating, formidable woman with flour dusted across her collarbones and a temperament like a lit powder keg. She turned, a wooden spoon raised like a weapon, ready to dress down whoever was loitering. The insult died on her tongue. "Lord above," Mrs. Gable breathed, dropping the spoon into a vat of gravy. The kitchen clatter didn't stop entirely, but the immediate vicinity fell into a localized, staring silence. Margot stood shivering in the doorway, her wool skirts clinging to her legs, dripping soapy gray water onto the flagstones. But it was her hands they looked at. In the harsh, yellow light of the kitchen fires, the lye burns were of violent, angry crimson, the flesh cracked in weeping, clear fluid. "The Duke!" Margot croaked. Her throat was bone dry. The words felt like sandpaper. He said, put honey on it. Put it on his account." Mrs. Gable's eyes widened, the flour on her face making her look momentarily ghostly. A scullery maid dropped a tin cup. It clattered loudly, rolling in a circle on the stone floor. "The Duke of Westmoreland told you that?" Mrs. Gable asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She wiped her massive hands on her apron and closed the distance, grabbing Margot by the elbow, careful to avoid her hands, and dragging her toward a prep table. Yes. Margot's teeth started to chatter. The adrenaline was draining out of her, leaving behind a cold, shaking exhaustion. Bess, get the jar of clover honey from the top pantry, Mrs. Gable barked, kicking a stool out from under the table. Sit down, girl, before you fall down, and fetch a basin of cool water. Clean water, you animals, not the washing water. Margot sank onto the stool. The wood was hard, but it felt like a luxury. She watched numbly as Bess, a young maid with wide, terrified eyes, scurried over with a ceramic bowl of water and a heavy glass jar. Hold still, Mrs. Gable ordered. She took Margot's right hand by the wrist. The cook's grip was surprisingly gentle. She dipped a clean linen rag into the cool water and began to dab at the raw knuckles. Margot flinched, sucking in a sharp breath. The water washed away the residual soap, but exposing the nerve endings to the air made them burn with a fresh, searing heat. Then came the honey. Mrs. Gable scooped it out with 2 fingers, thick, golden, and sluggish. She slathered it directly onto the burns. The texture was abhorrent. It was sticky and heavy, dragging across the broken skin, pulling at the microscopic tears in her flesh. Margot squeezed her eyes shut, biting the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. But after a minute, the airtight seal of the thick sugar began to smother the burning. A dull, throbbing ache replaced the sharp sting. Wrapping them now, Mrs. Gable murmured, producing strips of clean white cotton. She wound them tightly around Margot's hands, binding her fingers together in bulky, restrictive mitts. What did you do, Margot? Did you spill soup on him? Did you look at him wrong? He knelt down, Margot whispered, staring blankly at the scarred wooden table. The memory was disjointed, flashing in her mind like a broken magic lantern. He knelt in the dirty water. He took the brush. Mrs. Gable stopped rapping. She stared at Margot, her heavy jaw slack. Bess, pouring the remaining water away, froze. He took the brush, Margot repeated, her voice hollow. He scrubbed the floor. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the prep table. It wasn't the silence of awe. It was the silence of a bomb being discovered under the floorboards. Mrs. Gable tied off the bandage with a sharp, vicious tug. Margot winced. You foolish girl, Mrs. Gable hissed, her tone shifting from motherly concern to cold, hard dread. She leaned in, smelling of onions and fear. Do you think a duke scrubbing a floor is a fairy tale? Do you think he saved you? Margot looked up, her stomach twisting. I didn't ask him to. It doesn't matter what you asked. Mrs. Gable's voice was a frantic whisper. You made a countess look like a tyrant in front of the man she intends to marry. You made a duke lower himself to the mud for a rat from the city. They don't forgive that, Margot. They never forgive that. The highborn can play at being righteous, but it's us who pay the butcher's bill. Margot looked down at her hands. The thick cotton bandages were already blooming with faint, sticky yellow patches where the honey was seeping through. The throbbing in her knuckles pulsed in time with her heart. The kitchen, with all its light and noise, suddenly felt like a tomb. Mrs. Gable was right. Cynicism, her oldest and most reliable friend, settled back heavily over her shoulders. A lord's pity was a luxury a maid couldn't afford to survive. The bill came exactly 50 minutes later. Margot was sitting in the dark, drafty corner of the scullery, her heavily bandaged hands resting uselessly in her lap, when the sharp, clipped footsteps sounded on the stone stairs. It wasn't the erratic scrambling of a servant. It was the measured, authoritative march of the upper hierarchy. Mrs. Higgins, the head housekeeper, stepped into the kitchen. She was a tall, angular woman dressed in bombazine so stiff it looked like armor. A heavy ring of iron keys hung from her waist, clanking with a grim final authority. The bustling noise of the kitchen died instantly. Maids scrubbed pots quieter. Footmen suddenly found spots on the ceiling fascinating. Mrs. Higgins scanned the room, her cold, gray eyes passing over the sweating cooks and the greasy tables until they locked onto Margot in the corner. Margot, Mrs. Higgins said. Her voice didn't need to be loud to cut through the room. It carried a chilling, institutional frost. To my office, now. Margot didn't argue. She didn't cry. She pushed herself off the wooden crate, her wet skirts heavy and freezing against her calves. She couldn't use her hands to balance herself, so she walked stiffly, keeping her arms slightly raised, feeling entirely exposed as she crossed the kitchen. Every eye was on her. Pity, relief that it wasn't them, fear. She followed Mrs. Higgins up a short flight of stairs to a small windowless room off the main corridor. It smelled of ink, dried lavender, and accounting ledgers. Mrs. Higgins walked behind her heavy oak desk, but did not sit down. "You will pack your belongings," Mrs. Higgins said, devoid of any preamble. She stared at Margot's bandaged hands with open distaste. "You are to leave Oak Haven immediately." Margot's heart gave a single violent thud, then settled into a rapid, fluttering panic. "My wages, ma'am. I have worked 3 weeks this month. You have destroyed property," Mrs. Higgins countered smoothly, opening a ledger and running a dry, bony finger down a column of names. "You ruined a bristle brush. You spilled water on the antique oak of the East Gallery. And you conducted yourself with gross insubordination toward Countess Henrietta. We are deducting the cost of the damages from your wages. The balance is 0. 0. The word tasted like ash. Margot stepped forward, the terror of her father's rasping cough in that freezing tenement pushing through her ingrained deference. "Mrs. Higgins, please. My father needs the willow bark. He cannot breathe. The Countess ordered me to use the lye. I only did what I was told." "You humiliated a lady of the house in front of a guest of honor," Mrs. Higgins snapped, finally looking up, her eyes flashing with a ruthless loyalty to the establishment that fed her. "You manipulated a situation to draw the Duke's attention. You are a disruptive, insolent creature." "I didn't speak to him. He took the brush." "And you let him." Mrs. Higgins slammed her hand flat on the ledger. The sound made Margot flinch. "You stood there and let a peer of the realm ruin his garments doing your labor. You're dismissed, Margot. If you're not off the grounds in 10 minutes, I will have the groundskeeper set the dogs on you. Go." Margot stood frozen. The injustice of it wasn't a sharp pain. It was a heavy, suffocating weight. She had been punished for working. She had been punished for being abused. She was being punished because a powerful man decided to feel morally superior for 5 minutes, leaving her to bleed out in his wake. She wanted to scream. She wanted to smash the inkwell on Mrs. Higgins's pristine desk, but her hands were bound in useless, sticky cotton, and she was so very, very tired. Margot turned without another word. She walked out of the office, up the 5 flights of stairs to the freezing attic where the female servant slept. She owned almost nothing: a spare gray wool dress, patched at the elbows, a cracked wooden comb, a sliver of cheap soap. She couldn't use her hands to pack, so she awkwardly pushed her few possessions into a canvas sack, using her forearms and wrists, panting with the exertion, tears of pure, impotent frustration finally pricking the corners of her eyes. She hauled the sack over her shoulder, the rough canvas scraping against her neck. She didn't look back at the narrow cot. 10 minutes later, she pushed open the heavy iron-wrought service gate at the back of the estate. The sky had turned the color of a bruised plum. The rain, which had been a mild drizzle all morning, had strengthened into a driving, relentless downpour. The cold hit her instantly, slicing through her damp wool uniform. Margot stepped onto the mud path that led toward the city. The wind howled through the barren branches of the elm trees lining the estate wall. With every step, her boots sank an inch into the freezing, sucking mud. She had 6 miles to walk, no money, ruined hands, and a dying father waiting for medicine she couldn't buy. "Thank you, Your Grace," she thought bitterly, bowing her head against the driving rain. "Thank you for your mercy." The rain didn't just fall, it attacked. It drove down in sheets, heavy and freezing, plastering Margot's hair flat against her skull and sending icy rivulets down the back of her neck. Within 10 minutes, she was entirely soaked. The canvas sack slung over her shoulder felt like it weighed 50 pounds, the coarse fabric chafing the skin of her collarbone raw. She walked on the edge of the carriage path to avoid the deepest ruts, but the mud was everywhere. Thick, yellow clay that sucked at the soles of her boots, threatening to pull them off with every step. Her bound hands throbbed a relentless, burning rhythm, entirely useless, tucked stiffly against her chest to shield them from the downpour. She didn't cry. Crying would blur her vision, and if she stepped in a pothole and twisted her ankle, she would die out here in the cold. That wasn't a metaphor. It was the brutal, statistical reality of the poor. She was 2 miles from the iron gates of Oakhaven, her breathing coming in harsh, ragged gasps, when she heard the sound over the drumming rain. It wasn't the rattle of a carriage. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of a horse being ridden hard. Margot didn't stop. She didn't turn around. Aristocrats rode on this road. Drunks rode on this road. Neither meant anything good for a lone woman walking in a storm. She kept her head down, her jaw clenched, dragging her right boot out of the clay and planting it forward. The hoofbeats grew louder, a violent, splashing thunder. Then a massive shadow loomed to her left, blocking the faint gray light of the afternoon. A massive black gelding sidestepped into her peripheral vision, its hooves kicking up a spray of muddy water that splashed directly against Margot's knees. The horse was blowing hard, steam rising off its wet, muscular neck in thick white plumes. "Stop!" The voice was rough, loud enough to cut through the rain, and instantly recognizable. Margot's heart seized. She froze, her boots suspended halfway out of the mud. She slowly turned her head, the icy rain whipping across her cheek. Alistair, the Duke of Westmoreland, sat atop the horse. He wore no hat, and his dark hair was plastered to his forehead, dripping water into his eyes. He still wore the heavy gray woolen cloak from the morning, now dark and saturated with the storm. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with a furious, tight-lipped frustration. "Where are you going?" he demanded. Margot stared at him. The absurdity of the question short-circuited her brain for a second. Where was she going? She was walking in the mud with a sack. Where did he think she was going? A garden party. "To the city, Your Grace," she yelled back over the wind. Her voice was hoarse, lacking any of the deferential softness she was trained to use. She was too cold and too angry to pretend anymore. "In this?" Alistair gestured wildly to the torrential sky. His horse shifted uncomfortably, dancing in the mud. He pulled hard on the leather reins, controlling the massive animal with casual, brute strength. "Have you lost your mind? Get back to the estate." "I cannot, Your Grace." "I am giving you an order," he snapped, the inherent authority of a man used to absolute obedience flaring in his eyes. Margot's spine stiffened. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sudden white-hot fury. This man sitting on a horse that cost more than her entire neighborhood earned in a decade, barking orders after he had destroyed her livelihood. "You don't get to give me orders anymore," Margot shouted, her voice cracking, echoing harshly in the desolate road. "I don't work for you. I don't work for anyone, because of you." Alistair flinched. The anger in his expression faltered, fracturing into something confused. "What are you talking about? I sent you to the kitchens. I told you to have your hands seen to. And then you left." Margot stepped toward the horse, not caring that the beast could trample her. She raised her arms, holding up her heavily bandaged, yellow-stained hands. The rain immediately began to soak the cotton, washing away the honey, waking up the burning nerves beneath. "You scrubbed the floor to shame a countess. You made your point. Did you think she was just going to nod and let me go back to making beds?" Alistair stared at her hands, his jaw locked. The rain poured down his face, tracking through the small white scar on his eyebrow. He didn't speak. "Mrs. Higgins fired me," Margot laughed, a harsh, jagged sound completely devoid of humor. No wages, no references. 10 minutes to leave the grounds or she'd set the dogs on me. "That is what your grand, noble gesture bought me, Your Grace. It bought me the mud." She didn't wait for his response. She turned her back on him, hoisting the heavy, wet canvas sack higher on her chafed shoulder, and began to walk again. Her boots squelched loudly in the clay. 1, 2, 3. She counted her steps, ignoring the burning in her hands and the freezing wetness seeping into her bones. Behind her there was a sharp curse, muttered violently over the wind. Then, the heavy, wet thud of boots hitting the mud. Margot didn't look back. She heard the horse snort, followed by the heavy splashing footfalls of a man running through the deep ruts. A hand caught her shoulder. It wasn't a gentle, romantic grasp. It was rough, urgent, and heavy, pulling her backward so forcefully she stumbled. Alistair spun her around. He was standing in ankle-deep mud, his fine leather boots entirely ruined. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving under the wet wool cloak. Up close he smelled of rain, sweat, and wet leather. His silver eyes were entirely stripped of the cool, aristocratic detachment he had worn in the hallway. He looked raw. He looked horrified. "I didn't know," Alistair said. His voice was lower now, a desperate rumble beneath the sound of the rain. "I swear to you, I didn't think she would retaliate against you." "Then you are a fool," Margot spat, staring up at him, water dripping from her eyelashes. "You live in a world of silk and silver, Your Grace. When you break something, you just buy another. When I break something, I starve. You played a game with her vanity, and I am the one paying the forfeit." Alistair didn't let go of her shoulder. His grip tightened, hot and solid through her wet clothes. He looked down at her face, tracing the exhaustion, the fear, the sheer, unadulterated cynicism carved into her expression. "You're right," he said softly, the words barely carrying over the wind. Margot blinked, stunned. She had expected him to yell. She had expected him to defend himself, to pull rank, to remind her she was nothing. "I was a fool," Alistair continued, his eyes locking onto hers, intense and unblinking. "I acted on anger. I saw what she did to you, and I wanted to humiliate her. I didn't consider the fallout. I am sorry." An aristocrat apologizing to a maid in the middle of a muddy road during a thunderstorm. The absurdity of it made Margot dizzy. She tried to step back, but his hand anchored her. "Apologies don't buy willow bark," she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a crushing wave of despair. "My father is sick. I have nothing." Alistair looked at her bound hands, then back to her face. Without breaking eye contact, he reached up with his free hand and unclasped the heavy iron brooch at his throat. He pulled the thick, soaking wet woolen cloak off his shoulders. Before Margot could protest, he swung the massive garment around her. It was heavy, weighing her down, but the inside of the wool still held the radiant, intense heat of his body. It smelled deeply of cedar, horsehair, and him. "You aren't walking to the city," Alistair said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He stepped closer, reaching down to grab the heavy canvas sack from her shoulder, easily lifting it with one hand. "What are you doing?" Margot panicked, stepping back, pulling the oversized cloak tighter around herself purely by instinct. "I ruined your livelihood," Alistair said, turning toward his massive black horse, tying her sack to the saddle horn. "It is my responsibility to replace it, and I am not leaving you to die in a ditch to protect my pride." He turned back to her. The rain plastered his white linen shirt to his chest, the fine fabric turning translucent, but he didn't seem to feel the cold. "Come here," he ordered. Margot shook her head, terrified. "No, I cannot get on that horse with you. It is improper. If anyone sees—" "Margot," Alistair interrupted, stepping into her space, his towering frame blocking the wind. "You're fired, penniless, and standing in a mudslide. Propriety is a luxury you can no longer afford. Now give me your foot." He didn't wait for her to agree. He bent down, lacing his fingers together to form a stirrup. Margot stared at his hands. Large, capable, covered in yellow mud. She looked at his face, stern and resolute in the driving rain. Her cynicism screamed at her to run, to reject the charity that had already cost her so much. But the heat radiating from his cloak was wrapping around her freezing skin, and her hands throbbed with a sickening rhythm. Swallowing her pride, she lifted her mud-caked boot and placed it into the cupped hands of the Duke of Westmoreland. Alistair's hands gripped her waist. They were hard, unyielding, and hoisted her upward with a jarring force that knocked the breath from her lungs. Margot scrambled onto the massive black gelding, her wet skirts twisting awkwardly around her legs. She ended up seated sideways in front of him, perched on the edge of the polished leather saddle. "Hold on to the mane," Alistair instructed gruffly, swinging himself up behind her with effortless momentum. Margot didn't reach for the coarse black horsehair. Her bandaged hands throbbed in rhythm with the driving rain, the cotton wraps now heavy and sodden, leaking diluted honey and pinkish fluid down her wrists. She tucked her arms tightly against her chest, shivering violently. Alistair noticed. He shifted his weight, moving closer, his chest solid and radiating a deep, furnace-like heat through the wet linen of his shirt, pressed against her back. He reached around her with both arms to grab the heavy leather reins, effectively caging her in. "Keep your head down," he muttered, his breath warm against her freezing ear. He dug his heels into the horse's flanks. The beast surged forward. Margot gasped, her body jerking backward against Alistair's chest. The motion of a galloping horse was nothing like the gentle, swaying carriage rides she had watched ladies enjoy. It was violent. It was a rhythmic, bone-rattling collision of muscle and earth. Every time the horse's hooves struck the muddy road, the shock traveled up Margot's spine, jarring her teeth. She had no choice but to lean into him. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the nausea rising in her throat. The heavy wool cloak he had wrapped around her was a leaden weight, but it was trapping his body heat, creating a microclimate of cedar, damp wool, and sweat that slowly began to thaw the ice in her veins. For an hour, there was nothing but the deafening roar of the storm, the sucking sound of hooves in the mud, and the solid, unmovable wall of the Duke's chest behind her. Then the smell changed. The clean, earthy scent of the wet countryside gave way to the sharp, metallic tang of coal smoke, raw sewage, and unwashed humanity. The air grew thicker, catching in the back of Margot's throat. She opened her eyes. They were entering the lower city. The cobblestones were slick with greasy black rain. The towering, soot-stained brick tenements leaned toward each other across the narrow streets like rotten teeth, blocking out the remaining gray daylight. Gutters overflowed with refuse, turning the alleyways into foul, rushing streams. Alistair pulled back on the reins, slowing the horse to a heavy walk. He didn't speak, but Margot felt the sudden tension in his arms. The Duke of Westmoreland was entirely out of his element. A man in ruined fine clothes, riding a purebred horse through a neighborhood where men would cut a throat for half a loaf of bread, was a walking target. "Which way?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning the shadowed doorways. "Left at the butcher's pole," Margot said, her voice barely a croak. "Then down the alley past the ironworks." They navigated the labyrinth of squalor, intense silence. People stared. Faces, gaunt and hollowed out by factory labor and hunger, peered from broken windows and shadowed doorways. They looked at the massive black horse. They looked at the man, and they looked at Margot, wrapped in a lord's cloak, with a mixture of suspicion and deep, cynical knowing. "They think I sold myself," Margot thought, a fresh wave of humiliation burning her cheeks. "They think I am his whore." "Stop here," she said abruptly. Alistair pulled the horse to a halt in front of a narrow, rotting wooden door that hung slightly off its hinges. The smell of boiling cabbage and stale urine permeated the damp air. He dismounted first, his boots splashing into a puddle of stagnant water, entirely ruining whatever leather wasn't already destroyed by the country mud. He reached up, putting his hands on her waist again, and lifted her down. Her legs were numb. When her boots hit the uneven cobblestones, her knees buckled. Alistair caught her by the elbow, steadying her. "Easy." Margot pulled her arm away, stepping back. The heat of the ride was instantly stripped away by the freezing alley wind. "I can walk, Your Grace. I'm fine." She wasn't fine. She looked like a drowned rat. Her hands were useless stumps of dirty cotton, and she was terrified of what she would find upstairs. She turned to the door, pushing it open with her shoulder. "Wait," Alistair said. He untied her heavy canvas sack from his saddle. He didn't hand it to her. He hoisted it over his own shoulder and gestured to the dark, gaping doorway. "Lead the way." Margot stared at him, the absurdity of the situation making her dizzy. "You cannot go in there." "I'm carrying your bag." "You are a duke. This is a rookery. You will get fleas, or you will get robbed, or both." Alistair's expression flattened into a hard, unamused line. "I have survived war, Margot. I think I can survive your staircase. Go." Margot's jaw tightened, but she didn't have the energy to argue. She turned and began the climb. The staircase was pitch black, the wooden treads rotting and slick with damp. The air grew progressively staler with every floor. When she reached the fourth landing, she stopped in front of a warped door. From inside, a sound leaked out that made Margot's blood run entirely cold. It was a cough. But it wasn't a normal cough. It was a wet, rattling, desperate tearing sound, like wet canvas being ripped apart from the inside. Margot forgot the Duke. She forgot her hands. She shoved the door open with her shoulder and stumbled into the room. The room was freezing. The small cast-iron grate in the corner was empty, filled only with gray, dead ash. The single window was cracked, stuffed with old rags that did nothing to stop the biting draft. On a narrow cot shoved against the peeling wallpaper lay her father, Thomas. He was a skeleton wrapped in yellowed skin, his chest heaving violently as he fought for air. A threadbare wool blanket was tangled around his legs. Beside him, on the floor, was a rusted tin basin speckled with dark, fresh blood. "Papa?" Margot choked out, rushing to the side of the bed. She dropped to her knees, hitting the hard floorboards. She wanted to grab his hand, to smooth the sweaty, graying hair from his forehead, but her own hands were bound and throbbing. She hovered her clumsy, cotton-wrapped stumps over his chest, in a gesture of pure, impotent agony. Thomas's eyes fluttered open. They were fever-bright and glazed. He looked at her, then his gaze drifted past her shoulder. His eyes widened in confused terror. Margot looked back. Alistair ducked his head to clear the low doorframe, stepping into the cramped room. He took up too much space. The sheer breadth of his shoulders and the dark, imposing presence of him made the already suffocating room feel microscopic. Elias was standing in the center of the room, staring at the mattress on the floor. He had taken off his wet overcoat and draped it over the back of the single chair. He had also removed his suit jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp white button-down to the elbows. The shirt was wrinkled, and the tie was gone. But it was what Elias was staring at that made Arthur's stomach drop. Alistair crossed the room in 2 strides. He picked up the chipped ceramic pitcher, inspected the slightly cloudy water inside, and frowned. He didn't hand it to Margot. He knew she couldn't pour it. He walked to the bed, stepping carefully over the bloody basin, and knelt down beside her. "Lift his head," Alistair ordered. Margot hesitated, then carefully slid her bandaged forearms under her father's neck, supporting him. Alistair brought the pitcher to Thomas's cracked lips, tipping it slowly. "Slowly, man. Just enough to wet the throat," Alistair murmured, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. Thomas swallowed weakly, coughing up half the water, pulling away with a weak groan. Margot lowered him back to the mattress. Her heart was beating a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. Alistair stood up. He walked over to the cold iron grate. He crouched down, ignoring the soot on the floorboards, and pulled open the small wooden crate next to it. It was empty, save for a few pathetic scraps of coal dust. He stood up, turning to face Margot. "He has pleurisy. His lungs are filling with fluid. He needs heat, and he needs medicine. Willow bark will not cut it, Margot. He needs laudanum to suppress the cough, and he needs a doctor to drain the fluid." "I know what he needs," Margot snapped, the raw fear turning instantly into defensive anger. "But I have no money. The apothecary will not give me credit, and a doctor will not step foot in this building without a shilling up front. I was going to buy the bark with my wages today." Alistair looked at her. He didn't offer pity. He reached into the inner pocket of his ruined waistcoat and pulled out a heavy leather coin purse. He tossed it onto the small wooden table. It landed with a heavy metallic clink. "Take it," he said. Margot stared at the leather pouch. It was likely holding more gold than she would earn in 5 years. She felt a sickening wave of revulsion. No, Alistair frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. Don't be a fool. Your pride will kill him. My pride is all I have left. Margot stood up, her wet skirts clinging to her legs. She stepped toward him, her chest heaving. I am not your charity project, Your Grace. I am not a broken bird for you to mend so you can feel better about the mess you made this morning. You scrubbed a floor. You gave me a cloak. You gave me gold. You have balanced your moral ledger. Now get out. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the wet, ragged rattle of Thomas's breathing. Alistair didn't move toward the door. He looked at her, his silver eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her want to shrink backward. I am not balancing a ledger, Alistair said softly. He took a step toward her. I am responsible. I acted recklessly because I hated seeing you humiliated. In doing so, I humiliated you worse. I took your livelihood. I am paying it back. I don't want your money, Margot whispered, her voice cracking. Fine. Alistair turned away from her abruptly. He walked to the door, yanked it open, and stepped out onto the landing. Margot let out a shuddering breath, a tear finally breaking free and tracking hotly through the cold rain and soot on her cheek. He was leaving. It was over. The fairy tale was dead, replaced by the grim reality of the slums. But Alistair didn't go down the stairs. You! His voice boomed in the hallway, authoritative and harsh. Boy, come here! Margot heard the scuffling of feet. A neighborhood boy, likely drawn by the sight of the Duke's horse, had been lurking on the stairs. Take this, Alistair's voice carried through the open door. Run to the apothecary on the high street. Tell him the Duke of Westmoreland requires a doctor, 2 bottles of laudanum, clean bandages, and a carriage load of high-grade coal to this address. Immediately. Yes, my lord, the boy stammered. If he argues, Alistair added, his tone dropping to a dangerous, icy register. Give him this signet ring. Tell him if he is not here in 20 minutes, I will buy his shop and burn it to the ground. Go. Footsteps scrambled frantically down the wooden stairs. Alistair walked back into the room. He closed the door. He didn't look at Margot. He walked to the rickety wooden chair, pulled off his ruined, mud-caked boots, and sat down. I am not giving you money, Alistair said, crossing his arms over his chest, his eyes fixed on the empty grate. I'm purchasing medical care and fuel. You cannot stop me. Now sit down before you collapse. Margot stood frozen in the center of the room. The cynicism that had protected her for 20 years was buckling, cracking under the weight of this man's relentless, practical stubbornness. He wasn't acting like a savior from a penny dreadful. He was acting like a commander securing a perimeter. She looked at him, really looked at him. His fine clothes were ruined. His hair was plastered to his skull. There was soot on his knuckles. Margot walked to the edge of the cot and sat down beside her father. She rested her bandaged hands in her lap. For the first time that day, she didn't feel entirely alone. The smell of lye was gone. It was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of dried lavender and fresh beeswax. Margot stood in the doorway of the linen room at Somerset House, the Duke of Westmoreland's primary estate. The room was massive, lined from floor to ceiling with deep oak shelves holding hundreds of pristine white sheets, embroidered pillowcases, and heavy woolen blankets. It had been 3 weeks since the storm, 3 weeks since Dr. Harrison had arrived in the rookery, pale and sweating, clutching his medical bag and a bottle of laudanum. 3 weeks since Alistair had sat in the rickety chair all night, feeding the fire with the coal he had extorted from the apothecary, keeping the small, damp room in a state of sweltering heat until Thomas's lungs began to clear. Thomas was still weak, but he was alive. He was currently sitting in a small, private cottage on the edge of the Somerset grounds, breathing clean country air, employed to do light ledger work for the estate's steward. Margot looked down at her hands. The thick cotton bandages were gone, replaced by thin, clean gauze wrapped around her knuckles. The skin beneath was still tender, a shiny, tight pink. but the violent weeping sores had healed. She could flex her fingers. She could work. She walked into the room, running her fingertips lightly over the smooth edge of an oak table. She was not a maid here. She was the head of linens. It was a position of authority, with a wage of 8 shillings a week, her own private room, and no Countess Henrietta within 100 miles. Alistair had severed his engagement to Henrietta 2 days after the incident in the East Gallery. High society was still buzzing with the scandal. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. They were heavy, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. Margot's heart gave a familiar, subtle flutter, but the cold panic that used to accompany it was gone. She turned around. Alistair stepped into the linen room. He looked entirely different than he had in the slums. He wore a perfectly tailored dark blue coat, his cravat tied with austere precision, his dark hair brushed back. He looked every inch the powerful, unapproachable peer of the realm. But then he looked at her, and the silver in his eyes warmed, fracturing the icy facade. "Is the inventory to your satisfaction, Miss Margot?" he asked, stopping a few feet away. His hands were clasped behind his back. He never pushed into her space. He had learned in that tiny tenement room that she needed her boundaries respected. "It is, Your Grace," Margot replied, keeping her voice even, though a small, involuntary smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Though I found 3 tablecloths with frayed hems, I will have the seamstresses repair them by tomorrow." "Excellent." The silence stretched between them. It wasn't the suffocating, terrifying silence of Oakhaven. It was a comfortable, heavy quiet, filled with things unsaid but deeply understood. Alistair looked down at her hands. "Are they hurting you today?" "No," Margot lied slightly. "They ached when it rained." But she wouldn't tell him that. Alistair unclasped his hands and took a step forward. He reached out, slowly, giving her ample time to pull away. He gently took her right hand, his large fingers enveloping her bandaged knuckles with extreme care. His skin was warm. He didn't say he loved her. He didn't drop to his knee and propose. They were miles apart in station, and both were too pragmatic, too scarred by the world to pretend those gaps could be closed with a single romantic declaration. But he held her hand. He ran his thumb lightly over the white gauze, his eyes focused on the healing skin. "I have a dinner party next week," Alistair murmured, his voice low in the quiet room. "Lord and Lady Harrington, it will be tedious. I require someone to manage the seating arrangements. My steward is terrible at it." Margot looked up at him. She saw the question beneath the request. He was asking her to step out of the servant's shadows. He was asking her to stand beside him, in a small way, in the light. Her cynicism, an old armor she had worn for years, felt heavy and unnecessary. She looked at the man who had ruined his boots for her, who had carried her coal, who had seen her at her most humiliated and had offered only steady, practical respect. "I require a raise for managerial duties," Margot said, her voice perfectly flat but her eyes shining. "An extra shilling a week." Alistair let out a sharp, genuine bark of laughter. The sound echoed off the high ceiling, startlingly bright. He looked down at her, a rare, breathtaking smile transforming his harsh features. "Done," he said softly. He didn't let go of her hand, and for the first time in her life, Margot didn't want him to. She stood in the clean, lavender-scented room, her bruised hands held carefully in his, and finally let the armor fall to the floor. If you love this story of raw romance and standing up to arrogance, leave a like and let me know in the comments what you'd do in Margot's shoes. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a protective, brooding duke. Click that subscribe button and hit the bell so you never miss another dramatic historical tale. Your support helps bring more of these emotional, grounded stories to life. See you in the next one.